See, so it's half of you. So I'll be teaching MVC as if you don't know it. So if you don't know it, don't worry. But MVC is a way of designing your application so that it's a little more debuggable, reusable, understandable to you and to anyone reading your code. And iOS was designed with MVC from the start. So it's just an integral part to building iOS. Now, I'm going to do the demo today and on Wednesday. I'm kind of not going to follow MVC, but then next Monday, we're going to apply MVC to the demo I'm doing today and Wednesday, so you're going to get the full MVC treatment there. And I'll be having some slides on MVC on Wednesday to prepare you for next Monday. Okay? All right, so here's the demo. The demo I'm going to do is something I actually did a few years ago that really works well with Swift, which is a calculator. So we're going to build this calculator, and we're going to build it from scratch all the way. And I like to do my demos where I only type in stuff. I don't copy and paste big chunks of code in or whatever. I know I see a lot of laptops open. A lot of people like to try and follow along with me. I'm a fast typer, but usually in most demos you can keep up if you want. I don't recommend it necessarily, or certainly I don't require it. I'm going to, you'll be able to go back and watch this particular demo on video. Even Stanford people will be able to do that, because your first assignment is going to be to reproduce what I do. Okay, that is 90% of your first assignment. Reproduce what I'm going to do today and on Wednesday. So I'm not going to post the code because I want you to go through the experience of typing the code in. And you'll be watching on video, watching what I do again, and typing it all in. Okay, and I'll explain that on Wednesday. Okay, so I put on this slide a bunch of things that I'm going to cover, but I'm not going to go over it in advance. I'm just going to sit down and start doing it. So any questions before I dive in here? I know we're going a little fast, but I want to maximize your learning time. Do I have what?
Recommendation of which Xcode.
So the question is, which Xcode should you use? Well, you should just use the one in the Mac App Store. So just go to the Mac App Store. It's free. Use the one there, whatever the latest one is. If a new one comes out in the quarter, let's all switch over to it. Okay, let's just always be using the latest Xcode. Okay. No, we're not going to be using a beta or anything like that. We'll just use whatever the currently published Xcode is. Okay. So I'm going to start this demo actually by launching Xcode. So here it is right here, Xcode. And when you launch Xcode, let's hide others here, you're going to get this splash screen. And on this splash screen on the right, this is going to be all your projects. Now, this is the beginning of the quarter. We don't have any projects yet, but they'll all be listed here. So as the quarter goes by, this will fill up. You can turn this splash screen off if you don't like it, by the way. This splash screen also lets us do things like playgrounds and source code management right down here. We're not going to be doing that for a while. We're going to be focusing on this option right here, create a new Xcode project. And if you don't have the splash screen, you can get it File, New Project. Okay, same thing. Those are both the same thing. So I'm going to click right here on Create a New Project. When I create a new project, it wants to know what kind of project you want to create, because Xcode is actually used on Mac OS X and to build frameworks and all that stuff. But we're always going to be building iOS applications. And in fact, we're always going to use this template right here, the single view application. Okay, that's kind of your basic MVC starter application. And we're going to build very complicated apps out of that. But we're going to start here. So you always click on that one. Then it wants to know what you want to call your app, and we're building a calculator, so we're going to call our app Calculator. Okay? This organization name doesn't really matter. That's just going to appear in the copyright notice in the code that you write at the top in a comment, so don't worry about that. But this organization identifier, that is very important. Okay? This uniquely identifies you. Okay? So that on the next line, we can uniquely identify your calculator. So here, if you're a Stanford student, you want to use this reverse DNS notation here, edu.stanford.cs193p, and instead of instructor there, you want to put your SUNet ID, okay? Because nobody else has that but you, and that'll uniquely identify you. As I said, we're using Swift, not Objective-C, and we are going to build an app that works equally well on iPad and iPhone. That's called a universal app. You can pick to develop for only one or the other, but we are going to go universal here. We're not going to really be doing the iPad part of it for a couple weeks, but it is our intent to eventually build an app that works on both. Okay, we're not going to be using core data. That's object-oriented database stuff, so just leave that unchecked. And now it's asking where we want to save it. I strongly recommend saving in your home directory. This is my home directory here, in a folder called developer. Okay, you can put other folders in here if you want to arrange it more, but home directory developer, I highly recommend that. Source control, we will be talking about that at some point in the quarter, but we're not going to do it right off the bat here, so you can leave that unchecked as well. All right, so here's our first project. It's been created. So this is Xcode that you're seeing right here. This is Xcode's main screen. And the center is really what you're working on. The left area here is called the navigator. And the navigator you use to kind of choose what you're working on. But you can also do things over here like search through your whole project. That's this little guy. And look at all your breakpoints maybe, look at previous builds that you've done, browse your project by class hierarchy, all that stuff. But we're usually on the leftmost one here, which is just all the files in your project, which also can be organized hierarchically like this. And when you select something here on the left, the middle will fill up with what that you've selected. So here, I have the actual project itself selected. So these are the project settings, of which there are tons. All along the top here, you can see tons of settings. We'll go through them as the quarter goes on. And you've already seen some of them, like the bundle identifier there and the fact that it's a universal app. We're not going to talk about any more of this today, this project settings business. We're going to focus here on some of these files. And even some of these files, like this app delegate, I'm just going to move that down to supporting files to get it out of the way. Same things with these image assets, launch screen. We'll get to this later in the quarter, but I want to focus on these two files right here. Okay, main.storyboard and viewcontroller.swift. Okay, in the MVC world, by the way, this is the V, the view, and this is the C, the controller. But we'll talk about MVC on Wednesday. So what do these things contain? So this main.storyboard, if I click on it, you'll see it appear here in the middle. This is our UI. Okay, this is our user interface. So for a calculator, this is going to be a little display that shows the number we're working on or whatever at the top, and lots of buttons down here, number buttons, times, times, divide, plus, minus, square root. That's all going to be here. So we're going to build this entire user interface purely graphically. Okay, we're not going to be writing code, put button at this location, none of that. Okay, we just literally with our mouse, we're going to build this whole user interface. So what's the code? What do we need any code for? Well, this viewcontroller.swift, this is a Swift file. It's your first look at Swift for most of you. This controller is going to control that user interface. That's why we call it the view controller or the controller. It controls the user interface. And that means it's going to do things that are specific to how this user interface, a calculator's user interface, works. So when we press the digit buttons, it's going to have to update the display. When we press times, it's going to have to do some multiplication and then put the result in the display. So it's controlling the display. Okay, so we'll get back to this code in a moment, but we're going to start by building our user interface. And by the way, your user interface, you can see I have a low resolution screen here, so my UI doesn't even really fit in the space here. You'll probably have maybe a little higher resolution screen than I do. But if you don't, you can zoom in and out. I'm just right-clicking. If you right-click on the background area here, you can zoom in and out. You can also do it by double-clicking. So if I double-click on this, it zooms it to normal. If I double-click on the background, it zooms out. So that way I can see my whole UI. Now, when we build a complicated app, we're going to have a whole bunch of these little square areas. We call these scenes. And a scene represents kind of a phone screen full of information. Okay? And as you've used many iOS applications, you know that you transition from one screen to another as the user goes through the app. And that's how you're going to build your apps as well. And this storyboard is eventually going to have a big map showing all the transitions between all those scenes. Okay, so this storyboard is going to get big for big apps. You're going to get to see your whole application, which is kind of cool. So we're going to start small, though, just this one little screen right here, which is going to be our calculator. So let's start building our calculator with its display. So I want to make a display. So how do I do that? Well, that brings us to the right side, the right-hand side here, this whole right side. This is called the utilities area. You can see that it's got a bottom and a top. right? We want to go into the bottom, and on the third tab right here, which is called the Object Library, you'll see that there's tons and tons of objects in here, okay? Dozens of these things, and we're going to get to a lot of these by the end of the quarter. But these are the things you build your user interface out of. So kind of towards the top, not all the way at the top, but towards the top, you'll start seeing things like buttons and text fields and things like that. Well, this is what we need, obviously, to build our display here, is some sort of text field. And there's a couple of them here. This one called label, is static text, you see? And this one, text field, is editable text. In other words, you could touch on this one, and the little keyboard would slide up from the bottom, and you could type in it. So the calculator, you can't really touch on the screen and start typing, so we want this static text. So I'm just going to pick this up with the mouse and drag it out. Now, when I drag it out into my UI, you're going to see a lot of little blue dashed lines appearing. You see these? These are helping me put this in the right place. So I could put it right in the center, for example, of my view. I could put it up in a corner up here, which is what I'm going to do. Okay? You always want your things that you put in your UI, as much as humanly possible, to be on one of these dashed blue lines. And you'll understand why in a couple weeks when we start talking about auto layout. I'm going to do a little auto layout right here just to kind of give you a feel for it. But those dashed blue lines are going to be your best friend when it comes to building your user interface, and you'll quickly see why that is. Once you drag something out like this, these little things around it that show it's selected, right? They also are little resize handles, so you can grab them and resize them. When you resize, it also puts those dashed blue lines out there, okay? So you definitely want to, even when you're resizing, get those things lining up. You can also manipulate it directly, just double click on it. Like a calculator probably doesn't want to come up. This is going to be the initial state of this. It doesn't want to come up saying label. It probably wants 0. Something like that in its display. There's also things you want to set about this, though, or anything you drag in your UI, that you just can't direct manipulate. And that's what the top half of this utilities windows is for. Okay, so if you look at the top half here, there's a bunch of tabs across the top, including something like this, the size inspector for setting the size of this thing. And this tab right here, really important, this is the attributes inspector. And this is an object-oriented inspector. Depending on what you have selected, you'll have different user interface here in the top. And this lets you edit attributes about what's selected. So, for example, a calculator, the 0 doesn't really want to be on the left, right? Calculators, the numbers are on the right, and they kind of grow out from the right. And so we can easily fix that with this alignment thing right here. So I'm going to click this, and you see the 0 moves over to the right. And maybe I want a bigger font. You see the font right here. I can click on this, pick different fonts. I'm going to just move it up to like 32 point. It's a nice big font. You can notice it kind of cuts off. I made it so big that it's too small, so I can always just resize this larger to make that fit. So this is how we build our user interface. It's very direct manipulation and very object-oriented, as you'll start to see when we have different kinds of objects. So let's actually run this application. Okay, we haven't built any calculator-ness about it, but we have this one field. Let's run it and see what it looks like. So how do you run things? Well, you see right here where it says iPhone 6. This actually is a selector that lets you say where you want to run your application. So you can see you can run it on an iOS device if you have one connected. I don't have one connected currently, but you can do that. And we'll talk in a Friday section, probably in a week or two, about how to get your devices hooked up. But also there's these plethora of simulators here. iPhone 6, 6 Plus, iPhone 5, iPhone 4S, iPad Airs. And you can pick one of these to run on, and it'll actually simulate that device right here on your computer. So I'm going to run on the iPhone 6. Okay, I'm just going to hit play. You see this play button right here? That's how you simulate, so play. Now it's launching a simulator. It's a separate process, and it's going to run our app in there, and there it is. Now, you might say, what, big white square, that's not so good. And the reason this is so big is because the iPhone 6 has a very high resolution display on it, okay, the Retina display, and it's way higher resolution than my computer, okay? So I actually have to scroll around. See, there's the top of it, scroll up and down to get to it all. Luckily, if you go to Window, I'm in this simulator now, the iOS simulator. If you go to Window and Scale, you can scale it down to be smaller, and then it'll fit. Okay, so if you have a low resolution screen, you're definitely going to want to use Window Scale. Command 3 right there is another way to do it. Okay, so here's our UI. but it doesn't look too good, okay? Because where's this? We put this 0 in there, and it just never showed up. What did we do wrong? Well, we didn't really do anything wrong, and that 0 is actually there. It's just here. Let me line up these UIs. This is not necessarily exactly the same scale, but it's approximately the same scale. You can see that the 0 is actually off screen, okay? So it's there, but you just can't see it because it's over here off the screen, okay? And that's a problem, but that's a problem we can fix. So let's go fix that problem. Why is that thing off screen? Well, look at this UI right here, okay? What shape is it? It's square. Okay? No iOS device is square. There's not a single square iOS device in the world. They're all, tall and thin, or if you turn them sideways, then they're long and short, or even like an iPad. The aspect ratio on an iPad is slightly different than an iPhone. So they're all slightly different, but none of them are square. So why do we design our UI in a square? Because the way you design iOS interfaces, you design them in this square, and you give everything inside the square rules called constraints about what happens to them when they get squished down, either squished down vertically, squished down horizontally, depending on what kind of device they're getting put on, okay? So you put these rules in there. So what does it look like to put these rules in? Well, again, it's all direct manipulation. So I'm going to give some rules to this label right here to make it so that it knows what to do when this square gets squished down in any direction for any device. So what do I want the rules to be? Well, I always want this thing to use the whole width. However much width I have, I want it all. So I'm going to pin this right edge to this edge. Okay, I'm going to make it so those always are pinned to each other. And I do that with the control key. I've turned on sticky keys, so you can see down in the lower left here, it's showing the modifier keys I'm using. So right now I'm holding down control. And I'm going to control drag from the right edge of this to the container it's in. See how it's showing me what I'm dragged to? So when I drag to this container, it puts a menu up and says, oh, okay, you want some rule between that label's right edge and this thing's edge. What do you want it to be? Well, I can do a lot of things here. I could center this label vertically in this container, up, vertical up and down. I definitely don't want that. I want my label at the top, so I don't want that. I could make it the equal width, so I could make this label the same width as the container. I don't want that either, because I want this little margin there, right? But look at the top one, trailing space to container margin. This lets me pin the trailing space after my label to the margin of the container. So that's the one I want. So I'm going to click on this, and it does it. Now, see all these yellow and orange lines that appeared when I did that? That's because the system's like, okay, you've started telling me the rules for this label, but you haven't told me enough rules. I don't know what to do with this thing. So now it's showing you all the places where it's like the system's not sure what to do now when this thing gets squished. Before it was like, okay, well, you weren't telling me anything, so I'm not going to do anything. But now you're starting to tell me. So what do I do? So we have to fully specify both what happens horizontally and vertically to this thing. So we've only just started here. So let's pin this edge also, because we want this edge to stay on this side. So I'm going to hold down Control and drag. And now I'm going to pin the leading space to the container margin. Okay, boom, that did that. Still have orange going on here. That's because I haven't specified anything about the vertical position of this label. So I'm going to pin the top to the top. So hold Control again, drag up here. And this is now top space. Notice that it realizes where I am dragging to and from, right? So they can give me options that make sense, like top space to layout guide here. So I'm going to do that. So now I'm starting to get blue lines. You see these lines? I hope you can see that there. They're solid blue, not orange or red. Okay, that's because they're okay. So we are okay horizontally here, but we still have a problem vertically. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the problem is vertically, because I really don't want the bottom of this. I just want it to hang out wherever it wants to hang out based on the size of my font or whatever. So I don't really want to specify anything here. So why is this orange, and how do I get rid of this? Well, anytime you have orange, when you're doing this layout stuff and you don't know what to do, you want to go down to this button right here. Okay, this is the document outline. And when you click this, the little thing will slide out, a little shelf here. And this is an outline view of everything that's in your UI. Okay? And they're linked. So if I click the background, nothing is selected, then the background, the view, is what's selected here. But if I click this L0, which means a label with 0 in it, look, it selected my 0 label. And vice versa, if I click on this here, it's selected over here. So this is this same thing in an outline mode. This is really nice to have. Sometimes you have views that are overlapping and they're kind of in each other's way. You can always go here to select the one you want, okay? And you can control drag to these over here too. It's just as much control draggable as some of these other things. But we'll talk about top layout guide, bottom layout guide a little later. But what I really want you to focus on is this little yellow circle up here. Okay, anytime you got yellow and orange problems with this auto layout business, you're going to get this little yellow circle appearing in your document outline. And if you click it, it'll slide in a list of all the problems. And so here, I'll highlight over this. This is where all the orange and yellow is. It's saying the label with the 0 in it expected the height to be 39, but the actual height is 57. Well, that's because after I set this font, I just dragged this down a little bit to make space, right? I didn't know it was supposed to be 39. I just dragged down. And so it's saying that's wrong. Now, I could just try and drag it back up and meet this dashed line. This dashed line, by the way, is where it's kind of saying this is really where this thing wants to be, but the solid lines are where it actually is. So I could kind of drag it up to there, but I could be off by a pixel or something else. A much more reliable way is to click this little yellow triangle, okay? So I'm going to click this yellow triangle. It's going to bring up this pop-up window, and there's 3 ways to fix the problems, okay? One way, update constraints, this middle way right here. That's a way that says, hey, I want this label to be right where it is. So just make some constraints, make it up, make it happen. And it'll put some wacky constraints in there like 52 high, which is a bad constraint for it to be 52 high because this label wants to be its natural height. It doesn't want to be 52 high. So this is kind of forced constraints. You almost never want this one. Okay? Rarely do you want to force the constraints. Reset to suggested constraints would probably just work here. I'm not going to choose this one, but it would probably work. This one is going to make the constraints match the blue lines. Those dashed blue lines that I told you always want to meet, those are what's going to help the system pick suggested constraints. So since we dragged that label out to the blue lines perfectly, I'll bet if I said reset to suggested constraints, it might just work. Okay? But I'm actually going to show you this last option up on top, which is update frame. And what this says is take into consideration all the rules and move this label to where the rules say it should be. Okay? And I like this option a lot because it lets you kind of preview, do I have my little rules right? Okay, so let's try that. Let's see if we'll tell this label, go ahead and move yourself and size yourself to obey these 3 rules we put in, and we'll fix the misplacement. So let's try it. And sure enough, it did it. It says there are no auto layout issues. If I go back to my document outline, this little yellow circle is gone. If I look in my view, everything is blue lines, no yellow or red. Okay? So that's your crash course on auto layout. And we're going to talk a lot more about auto layout. In fact, even on Wednesday, I'm going to do another auto layout with all the buttons, right? The keypad buttons and all that, which is a lot more things being laid out. But let's see if this fixes our problem. Let's go ahead and run our application again. So I'm just hitting that play button. Here it is. Oh, we got our 0 this time. You see how it pinned this 0 to that edge? And not only that, if we rotate this phone, which you can do in the simulators menu, hardware, rotate, look, the 0, this got wider, and the 0 kept pinning itself over to that. And it also stayed on the top, even though this whole thing got shorter. Okay, and if I rotate back, the 0 stays there. Question?
So what did it do with the bottom edge? Like what did the actual update frame end up doing?
What did the update frame in the document outline do?
Yeah, so
it moved this bottom edge up. You see, this is only 39 pixels high now. It was 52. So yeah, it just moved it up. And if other things had been yellow, it could have moved the whole thing, right? It would move that whole rectangle wherever the rule said. But in this case, it fixed that one problem by moving it up. Good question. Okay, so that's good. All right, so that's it for auto layout part 1. So now let's talk a little bit about connecting our user interface that we're building right here up to the code. because we want that code to be able to talk to the user interface. Otherwise, how are we going to have the number buttons make numbers appear up here in the display, or the times button give the results of the calculation up here? We got to be able to talk to this. So how do we do that? And the answer, first step, is we need to get both this Swift code, the controller, and this view on screen at the same time. Okay, because we're going to connect them, so we need them on screen at the same time. And there's a lot of ways to do that, but I'll do the simplest way right here, which is this little button called the Assistant Editor. All right, so I'm going to click that, and look, it put them both on screen at the same time, exactly what I wanted. Now, it's all a little crowded here. Even if I expand my view a little bit, it's like, it's all smashed in here. Luckily, the navigator and the utilities can also be hidden. See these buttons up here, these 3 buttons? This left one, if you click it, hides the navigator, and this right one, if you click it, hides utilities. Okay? So now we have both my UI, and over here we can still double click to zoom out. But the thing is, anytime we're actually connecting our UI to our code or trying to edit anything in here, you need to be zoomed to normal. Okay? For example, if I try to select, if I'm zoomed out and I try to select this 0, I just can't. This is really kind of a bird's eye view. It's just for seeing what your UI looks like. If you want to actually work on it, you double click to zoom in on the scene that you're interested in. Okay, so here's our Swift code. I'm actually going to delete these. We don't need them for the calculator. We will need these things for future applications, but we don't need it for the calculator. And this is your first look at Swift. Okay, so Swift, as I said, very concise language, but it's basically an object-oriented language. It's going to look a lot like C. Some things look a lot like Java. It's kind of the, best of a lot of different worlds at once. Now, this import is just importing the UI portion of iOS. You usually won't have to specify imports yourself unless you start using frameworks that are not, the base frameworks, and we'll get to that probably weeks into the quarter where you finally have to do an import yourself. So this is how it automatically got put here for us. And so this is really your first line of Swift code. Okay? Appropriately, it's a definition of a class, because Swift is fundamentally object-oriented, and here we're defining a class. So what does the syntax look like to define a class? You got the keyword class, you got the name of the class. Now, this name, view controller, pretty bad name. Okay, it's very generic. Really, this should probably be something like calculator view controller, something specific to this particular scene that we're working on right here that it's controlling. This is the default name it gives you. I don't want to spend the valuable demo time showing how to rename this, because unfortunately I can't just type a new name here because I got to keep the UI in sync with it, so I would have to do something in the UI as well. But for now, for your first assignment or two, we'll just call this view controller, but down the road you're going to want to pick better names. And of course you're going to be building multiple of these scenes in this class in the same app in the future, so of course they'll all have different controller names. Okay? This colon UI view controller, that's inheritance. That's its superclass. Okay? Swift is single inheritance, so you can only inherit from one class. It's perfectly fine in Swift not to inherit from a class if you don't want to. All right? But here, we have to inherit from UI view controller because we want all this magic that allows us to control the UI, like that whole auto layout business, and there's a ton of mechanism in here for allowing the controller to control this UI. So obviously we do that. So all view controllers, all controllers of these little scenes always inherit from either from UI view controller directly, or they inherit from a class that inherits from UI view controller up the chain. So, and then inside this curly brace is simply all the instance variables and methods in this class. Okay? So very simple syntax to define a class. So let's dive right into making some instance variables and methods so you can see what those look like. And this was segued to because we're going to say we wanted to connect this UI to this code. So let's do that. Let's connect this label right here into this code. And then we're going to do that by making an instance variable. In Swift, we call them properties. Okay, so if you hear me say property, I'm basically talking about an instance variable, right? A variable that is part of the class. Every instance of the class gets its own copy of it. Hopefully you all know what an instance variable is. If you don't, again, this class heavy object oriented, so you should definitely know that. So I'm going to make a property here, an instance variable, that points to this label so that I can update the label's text. right? I need to be able to talk to this label. And the way you do that in iOS, in Xcode, is you hold down Control, just like we did when we were making a connection to the edge. So I'm holding down Control and clicking on the label, but instead of going to the edge, I'm going to go into the